This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
You're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome everyone to Notes from the Edge, a subshow of our Star Trek Discovery podcast, The Edge. I'm C Bryan Jones, or Chris, and I'll be your host as we flip through the pages of our notebook. In Notes from the Edge, we'll explore connections between Discovery and the greater Star Trek universe, which includes the prior 6 TV series and 13 films, as well as the massive literary universe, because there are elements from there that are being worked into the series. And we'll also delve deeper into some of the ideas unique to Discovery. I kick off each episode of Notes with my thoughts on the latest episode of Discovery, which this time means The War Without, The War Within. I'll cover 5 main points in the thoughts section: the status of the war, Tyler and Burnham, the Spore plan, the return of Captain Georgiou, and Burnham and Sarek. Then, in the notes section, I'll delve into the USS Saratoga, Starbase 12, and Starbase One. Thoughts may be a bit shorter than usual this time because I'm waiting to see how this episode and the finale fit together. The War Without, The War Within felt very much like a setup for the finale, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into everything and what might be happening. I'd like to start with the status of the war, however, because in the last episode of Notes from the Edge, I said that Discovery created a new timeline when they jumped back. That view was based on the map that we were shown, which implied that the Klingons had overrun the Federation. But apparently the situation is not as dire as it seemed.
Nearly 20% former Federation space has been occupied.
In that case, my assertion that a new timeline has been created may not be accurate. If only 20% of Federation space is occupied, then I think Starfleet could push the Klingons out, reclaim the space, and it could fit well into the overall history of the timeline that we know. My comment last week was based on the idea that almost all of Federation space, or a very large portion, had been taken over by the Klingons, and that's just something that we've never heard of before. And because they also jumped 9 months into the future, it felt like a situation where something had happened that shouldn't have happened, such as All Good Things, which I mentioned last time, or the war in yesterday's Enterprise, and that's the reason that I felt that way. But based on this, I think that's probably not going to turn out to be the case. However, this plan to crush Kronos presents its own problem. If the Federation, with the help of Emperor Georgiou, reduces the Klingon homeworld to ashes, that wouldn't fit very well with the timeline that we know. But that may not be what they will do, so I'm not going to speculate. We'll just wait and see. For the moment, I'm operating under the assumption that, 9 months passed, the Federation lost some ground, but they'll be able to push the Klingons back. But this is one of the big challenges of doing a prequel, and the story of Discovery has presented so many potential obstacles to maintaining internal consistency, and often, I feel, unnecessarily. Maybe they'll all be reconciled neatly, and we'll look at the whole picture and say, that's cool, very clever. So let's regroup next week and just see where we are. Now, let's talk about Tyler and Burnham briefly. And to start, I'm going to talk about Tyler and various other people. First, there's the scene between Tyler and Saru in sickbay, and this scene is really good, I think. And once again, Doug Jones just hits it out of the park, in my opinion. I'm so impressed with him, and Shazad Latif is good in this scene as well. There's also the scene with Tyler and Stamets in the corridor, and I'm glad that they addressed this by having them encounter each other, and also, at this point in time, not having it turn into a huge blow-up or a huge scene. I think the scene that they did was fine, and I think Stamets showed incredible restraint. Tyler's reaction was, I guess, natural, and there's just so much to delve into with Tyler and what he did while he was influenced by Voq. And whether they're going to do that in the next episode or it's going to come next season, I don't know. There's not going to be a lot of time in the next episode for it, probably, but there's a lot there. So I'm curious where they're going to go with that. But at least they did address it a little bit with that scene. And then there's also the mess hall scene with Tyler and Tilly and the others. The Tilly part was very in character for her. Just go over to him, sit with him, show support, don't force anything. She just tells him, I'm here. She's really a very empathetic character. Everyone else gathering around him to eat was a bit much. I mean, on the one hand, I understand showing support for a crew member who you know has been through an ordeal and something that's not under his control. And if we are talking about life in a more enlightened time, then I understand everyone being able to intellectually know that it was Voq, not Tyler, who killed Dr. Culber and tried to kill Burnham. Although these crew members may not know about the latter. They may not know that he tried to kill Burnham. It's one of those things where we don't know how much information has been passed along about what happened in the mirror universe. But on the other hand, I don't think such events should just be glossed over. And I felt in that scene a little bit like everything that had happened was just brushed under the rug. No worries. It's fine. That's probably not the intention of the writers and not the intention of the scene. But when it has to go by so quickly, it can come off like that. The big scene, of course, is the one between Tyler and Burnham. I've watched this scene 4 times now, and I still don't really like it. I'm mixed on it. My first reaction to it was very negative. I don't feel so negative now, having watched it 4 times, but it is a mixed bag. Sonequa Martin Green is really excellent, and her acting in this scene is some of her best, in my opinion. There are many times during Discovery where I really don't connect with her, although whenever that happens, I remember that she is portraying a human raised on Vulcan, and I try to channel my take on the acting through that. How would you approach being a human, moving to Vulcan as a child, being raised essentially as Vulcan, but inside you still have all of these human emotions? And then how do you portray that? And I think that's what she's trying to do, and I think she does a pretty good job of it most of the time, but I don't know, there are moments where it doesn't quite connect for me. But here she is really good, and she is struggling with the intellectual versus emotional balance that I feel is missing from that mess hall scene that I just talked about. What I don't like here is Tyler, or more specifically, I don't like the writing. And there's a reason for that. There are moments that are fine. In fact, initially, I think that Tyler comes off just fine. But the jump to Tyler accusing Burnham of just looking for a reason to call the whole relationship off doesn't work. And I don't think Tyler would see the situation this way. He seems genuinely concerned about Burnham in the sickbay scene with Saru, and he seems genuinely upset at the actions that he took toward Burnham at the beginning of this scene. And I don't believe that he would jump to this conclusion, nor try to put a guilt trip on Burnham. I'm just not buying that that is his character, because it's at odds with pretty much everything else that we've seen about him. This is not how you handle the complexity of the character or the relationship, so I expect more from the writers here. This just didn't feel right. This has been an interesting and complex relationship, so I would expect them to treat it as such all the way to the end. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand part of the point that they were trying to make, and I certainly understand Burnham talking about the person who she loved, the person who loved her, his hands around her neck, that he wanted her dead. I understand where they're going with that, and it's an important message. It's just that the setup to get to that by having Tyler make this sudden jump, this sudden guilt trip, it felt out of character. So this scene for me is a very mixed bag, and it's one I'm going to have to watch several more times and just continue to think about how I feel about the whole thing. Moving on, let's talk about the Spore plan. I've seen some people get very upset about the science behind this, and I'll admit that on the surface it seems awfully convenient and almost magical. But despite Tilly saying that they are terraforming a moon, which may cause the viewer to draw parallels with Project Genesis and the Wrath of Khan and the Search for Spock, that isn't really what they are doing. They're just using an existing body to rapidly grow spores. And more importantly, I think we need to remember that we cannot judge these things by present-day science. What may seem impossible to us today could be very practical 300 years from now. And we're watching a television show in which we take faster-than-light travel and teleportation of human beings for granted, as if these are the easiest things in the world to do. Neither of these is likely to be practical in the next few hundred years, and warp speed is most likely impossible, in general. Growing some mushrooms by driving spikes into the soil of a moon with an atmosphere is far more feasible. Now, that's not to say that I like this solution. I think it's more of a lazy deus ex machina than anything. But let's not lose our minds attacking the science behind it when we blindly accept other scientifically difficult or impossible things because the very foundation of Star Trek could not exist without them. It's an interesting idea that they have. It's a bit out there to think that they're just going to be able to grow all these spores suddenly so they can make a jump. But, we've got one episode left, so we've got to find a way to get them there, and this is what they came up with. So let's see where it goes. At least visually it was cool watching the spikes go down and watching the pulses and watching all the spores fly up into the air. That was kind of cool. I'd also like to talk about Georgiou for a moment. I love Michelle Yeoh, and I'm glad to see her back on the bridge. I think the dynamic between her and Burnham, and also her and Sarek, which was unexpected, but was really good in this episode, I think it's all really interesting. However, there's something near the end of this episode that really bothers me.
I stand before you with a mission. At 2100 hours, the USS Discovery will jump for the Klingon homeworld in order to map its surface and isolate vulnerabilities and military targets. This brave team will be the first to visit this inhospitable planet since Captain Archer and the crew of the Enterprise NX-01 nearly 100 years ago. So allow me to introduce you to the person who will chart your course to Kronos. Captain Philippa Georgiou. Thank you. Though long presumed dead, Captain Georgiou was recently rescued in a highly classified raid of a Klingon prison vessel. She was transported
Really?
aboard Discovery with my...
Allow me to introduce you to the person who will chart your course to Kronos? Captain Philippa Georgiou? Really? I mean, Cornwell just insulted the intelligence of the entire bridge crew. And don't tell me that only Saru and Burnham know the truth, and that everyone else believes that Georgiou was rescued from a Klingon prison ship after all this time of knowing that she's dead. The entire bridge crew and others saw Emperor Georgiou's holographic projection on their own bridge in The Wolf Inside. And these are very smart people. They're certainly going to connect the dots, probably in seconds. It's dramatic. It's a twist for the story, I know. But come on. Just tell the bridge crew that the Terran Emperor has agreed to help. You're not fooling anyone, Cornwell. And if you are, that's kind of sad. And that's to say nothing about the foolhardy plan of putting a tyrant in the captain's chair of the most advanced ship in your fleet, the ship that already once bridged universes, and to put a massive arsenal of weapons at the fingertips of that tyrant. We'll see how it turns out. This is an area where I want to wait and see, but this twist is something that sounds a lot better on paper than in practice, in my opinion. I'm glad to see Michelle Yeoh back in the captain's chair, but I don't know. I think this was a little bit of a leap. The last thing I want to mention is Burnham and Sarek.
During my mind meld with Saru, I learned of your attachment to the Klingon spy and what he did to you. Such events are clearly troubling.
I'm fine, Sarek.
I remain unconvinced. There is irony here, of course. The man you fell in love with was a Klingon.
I don't know what he was.
There is also grace. For what greater source of peace exists than our ability to love our enemy?
That's a great line, and it's one that I feel is very Star Trek. This bit here that I'm going to talk about with Burnham and Sarek is something that I didn't really expect to talk about, but watching the episode, probably the third time I was watching the episode, I really started thinking about this. And as I watched Sarek talk to Burnham, and as I thought of how many fans cite the Sarek-Burnham relationship as a terrible thing and a reason to invalidate Discovery because we've never heard of Burnham, and how can Spock have an adopted sister, and it doesn't make any sense. And just because we haven't heard of it before doesn't mean that it can't be a thing. And what really occurred to me was how little we know about each person with whom we interact. Think about all the people who you talk to every day. Think about your colleagues in particular. Why is it so hard for us to imagine that someone, particularly someone as important and accomplished as Sarek, had a life before the moment we first met them, and that there is more to this life than we have been told? This is the reality with almost every person we know in real life. It's preposterous to think that we know everything about someone and that any new information that comes to light is invalid. I think the Sarek-Burnham relationship actually enriches the Sarek-Spock story. It's not something that should invalidate Discovery, but rather it's a case where Discovery is adding to the Star Trek that we know in a very meaningful way. I also like Sarek's last line.
Do not regret loving someone, Michael.
This is a very valid statement for almost anyone, as love inevitably leads to heartbreak at some moment in our lives. To hear this spoken by Sarek, a Vulcan, is profound. All right, that's all I have in thoughts this week. I'm really waiting, as I said, to see what happens in Will You Take My Hand, since this episode was so much a setup for the big finale. An episode that I think might be a little bit longer than the ones that we've been getting. I'm not sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if we come close to an hour in that episode, because there's just so much left to do. And there's only one episode left to do it in, so I'm looking forward to seeing what we get in that finale. Now, for notes, we'll be covering large things that we build that float in space, and sometimes go. Those would be ships and starbases. And the first is
Stardate 4851.5. A cloaked raider tails the USS Saratoga into space dock at Starbase 22, then ignites its antimatter supply in a suicide mission. Days later, similar assaults are carried out on bases 19 and 12, resulting in the loss of 1/3 of our fleet.
Like Enterprise, Saratoga is a name that has long been favored by Starfleet. There have been 5 starships named Saratoga, an unnumbered 21st century ship, the NCC 1887, the NCC 31911, the NCC 31911A, and the one that we hear about in The War Without, The War Within. The first on the list here, the 21st century ship, is mentioned in the Enterprise episode The Forgotten. This is the ship on which crewman Jane Taylor was serving when Trip called her over to be part of his engineering team aboard the NX-01.
The letter, how's it going?
I got as far as... I regret to inform you.
That's a little dry, sir.
You're not real. You don't have to call me sir.
So what's the problem? The letter doesn't have to be long. The captain told you that. You can't think of anything.
Wish it was that simple.
I served on Enterprise for 3 years. You pulled me off the Saratoga to be on your team. Captain Brody was pretty angry at you.
I forgot about that.
You told me I'd make a fine chief engineer someday.
You will.
The NCC 1887 is the Saratoga that many viewers may think of first. This is the ship that we see at the start of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home.
It appears to be a probe, Captain. From an intelligence unknown to us.
Continue transmitting universal peace and hello in all known languages. Get me Starfleet Command.
Ready, Captain.
Starfleet Command, this is USS Saratoga patrolling Sector 5, neutral zone. We're tracking a probe of unknown origin on apparent trajectory to the Terran solar system. Attempts to communicate with the probe have been negative on all known frequencies.
Continue tracking Saratoga. We will analyze transmissions and advise.
Roger, Starfleet. Saratoga out.
This Miranda-class ship can also be found in the TOS comic The Apocalypse Scenario by Len Wein, published in 1987. That's number 26 in DC's TOS series. And in the Excelsior novel Forged in Fire by Michael A. Martin and Andy Mangels, which was published in 2007. The NCC 31911 is also a Miranda-class ship, and was first mentioned in the TNG episode The Measure of a Man as part of an on-screen graphic. More prominently, however, it is the ship on which Commander Sisko served as first officer in Emissary, the destruction of which set the DS9 story in motion. As you would expect, Sisko's time on that ship plays a prominent role in the 1996 DS9 novel Saratoga, by Michael Jan Friedman, and it also appears in Robert Greenberger's New Frontier short story, Leffler's Logs, in which my favorite TNG ensign, Robin Leffler, receives a tour of the ship. You'll also find this Saratoga either in action or being mentioned in other parts of the expanded universe, including the 1995 DS9 video game Crossroads of Time for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, the 1997 Voyager comic Ghosts by Laurie S. Sutton, the DS9 Tales of the Dominion War short story Requital by Martin and Mangels from 2004, and Keith DeCandido's 2005 novel Articles of the Federation. You'll also see a model of Sisko's Saratoga in his office aboard Deep Space Nine, in the episodes Battle Lines, and in the cards. The NCC 31911A, yet another Miranda-class ship, is mentioned at the start of the 6th season DS9 episode, Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night.
The Saratoga put in this morning.
We are not having another party.
I promise, not more than 50 or 60.
I could see it now. 200 people jammed into our quarters, eating, drinking, laughing.
It sounds awful. What if I promise absolutely no laughing? No, I mean it. You won't see a single smile the entire evening. It'll be the grimmest party you've ever been to.
The registry number isn't mentioned in the episode, of course. It comes from the aforementioned novel Saratoga. The episode takes place in 2374, at least the present-day portions of it, and there is further inconsistency introduced by the Armada 2 video game, which is set just 3 years later in 2377. In the game, the USS Saratoga is a Sovereign-class ship like the Enterprise E. It is unlikely that there would be two ships named Saratoga in service at the same time, and there is no suggestion that the Miranda-class Saratoga A was destroyed, although it's possible. So these two ships are generally considered to be a reference to the same vessel. Not that it really matters, we're talking about a video game versus a television episode, but it's just a little something to note, and highlight how these discrepancies present themselves when we're dealing with the expanded universe. Let's move on to Starbases. Admiral Cornwell mentions 3 Starbases as being the target of Klingon attack: 12, 19, and 22. Of these, Starbase 12 is the only one that has been referenced in past Star Trek. It made many appearances in the original series and the Next Generation, and its location in the Beta Quadrant and proximity to both the Klingon and Romulan empires made it a very important outpost. In Space Seed, all the way back in the first season of the original series, that's the episode, of course, in which we first meet Khan, Starbase 12 is where the Enterprise is headed when it encounters the Botany Bay.
James Kirk, commanding the Starship Enterprise.
I see.
And your name?
I have a few questions first. What is your heading?
Our heading is Starbase 12, a planet in the Gamma 400 star system. Our command base in this sector. Is that of any use to you?
And, my people?
72 of your life support canisters are still functioning.
You will revive them.
As soon as we reach Starbase 12.
I see.
In Season 2 of the original series, in Who Mourns for Adonais, the Starbase is mentioned again.
Captain's log, stardate 3468.1. While approaching Pollux 4, a planet in the Beta Geminorum system, the Enterprise has been stopped in space by an unknown force of some kind. Lieutenant, relay our position and circumstances to Starbase 12 immediately. Mr. Sulu, try rocking the ship. Full impulse power forward and back. Aye, aye, sir.
In the first season of The Next Generation, when strange things are afoot with Starfleet Command in Conspiracy, an unusual order at Starbase 12 is one of the early signs.
Starfleet's finest. Fancy meeting you here.
We all came secretly, Picard, to discuss the threat.
What threat?
Have you noticed anything about Starfleet Command lately? Anything unusual?
No. But we've been on the Outer Rim for a while. We haven't had much contact with them.
Some of us have seen strange patterns emerging. Unusual orders. High-ranking officials backing irrational proposals.
Starbase 12 was completely evacuated for 2 full days. No explanation given.
In the 3rd season TNG episode Captain's Holiday, Starbase 12 is where the Enterprise stays while Picard takes a trip to Risa.
What's the treatment?
A week's shore leave.
No. Impossible.
Jean-Luc, I could make that an order.
But you won't. Oh, Beverly, you know I loathe vacations.
You loathe going on vacations. Once you're there, you have a marvelous time. Why, you told me that your 4 days on Zeitkin 3 were wonderful.
I lied. Look. The Enterprise is scheduled to spend a week undergoing maintenance overhaul at Starbase 12. While there, I promise that I will make full use of available recreational activity.
In the 5th season episode Power Play, Starbase 12 is referenced again as Picard talks to Troy, who has been possessed by the life force of Captain Schumer of the starship Essex.
Why didn't you tell us this? Why the deception? The violence.
Because, as I said, I knew you would not believe us. Even now, I know you don't.
What was your vessel's designation and its complement?
NCC-173. Daedalus class starship, crew 229.
Under whose command in this sector?
Admiral Utan Narsu, Starbase 12. You will find all this in Starfleet records.
I don't need to see the records.
Then you know I am correct.
What's interesting about Power Play is that, because of the records of the Essex, Starbase 12 was in operation in 2167, which is just 16 years after the launch of the NX-01. Moving on in TNG, in the 6th season episode Aquiel, Starbase 12 is once again a destination for the Enterprise.
Medical Officer's Log Supplemental. Commander Morag and Lieutenant Unari are being kept under close observation. So far, no sign of coalescent behavior has surfaced.
Aquiel and Morag will be transferred to a secure medical facility on Starbase 12. Maybe we'll know more by the time we get there.
Yeah, right.
It could be Morag. We don't know for sure.
Sure.
In the expanded universe, Starbase 12 appears in the 1983 TOS novel Black Fire by Sonny Cooper, the 1984 novel The Final Reflection by John M. Ford, which you'll remember from an earlier episode, in fact the first episode of Notes from the Edge, is the source of the Klingon Black Fleet references in Discovery. Also, it appeared in the 1985 TOS novel Ishmael by Barbara Hambly, the 1989 TOS novel Vulcan's Glory by D.C. Fontana, the 1996 TOS novel The Joy Machine by James Gunn, the 1997 TNG novel Ship of the Line by Diane Carey, the 2003 Lost Era novel Well of Souls by Ilsa J. Bick, and the 2013 TOS novel Devil's Bargain by Tony Daniel. Starbase 12 also appears in all 3 of the Voyager Dark Matters novels, Cloak and Dagger, Ghost Dance, and Shadow of Heaven, all written by Christy Golden and published in 2000. And Keith DeCandido included Starbase 12 in his 2002 duology, The Brave and the Bold. The comics also make use of Starbase 12 in The Wormhole Connection, the very first issue of DC's TOS series published in 1984, and What Goes Around, number 41, in that same DC series. That issue was published in 1987. Of course, many role-playing game modules have included Starbase 12, and these include the FASA modules, the Orion's Book of Common Knowledge, Conflicts of Interests, the Federation, Star Trek IV Sourcebook Update, Decision at Midnight, Star Trek The Next Generation Officer's Manual, and the Federation Ship Recognition Manual. I mentioned earlier that Power Play established that Starbase 12 is in operation in 2167. This was clarified by the 2003 Decipher RPG module Starfleet Operations, which established that Starbase 12 was christened in 2163. Christopher L. Bennett built upon this in his Rise of the Federation novel Uncertain Logic, published in 2015, by stating that the facility was under the command of Admiral Utan Narsu, who you'll remember from Power Play, in 2165. So Starbase 12 has been an important part of Earth's exploration of space pretty much from the start. Now that we've talked about a starbase that is what we would expect it to be, a single facility, let's talk about one that isn't, or may not be. Starbase One sounds really important, but prior to The War Without, The War Within, it was only seen on screen twice. In the Kelvin timeline, in 2009 Star Trek, and also in Star Trek Into Darkness. In those films, Starbase One is the facility in orbit of Earth at which the Enterprise and other ships dock, and of course they depart from there on their missions. In the Prime timeline, Starbase One is never mentioned on screen. The large space dock seen orbiting Earth, which many people think of as being Starbase One, is simply referred to as Space Dock. This space dock has been called Starbase One in the literature, however, but it is probably just part of an overall infrastructure referred to as Starbase One. Now, I say probably because there are many different sources here, and everyone has their own take. And there is no clear explanation as to what Starbase One is. But based on novels and video games, Starbase One seems to comprise a number of facilities in and around the Sol system. This includes the Earth Space Dock, which I just talked about, a space station in the Oort cloud, and perhaps some other facilities. Sometimes it seems to be a space station orbiting a planet. Sometimes it seems to be a facility on the surface of a planet. Time's Enemy, the 1996 DS9 novel by L.A. Graff, that's part of that series where we had a book from each series, that established Starbase One as being in the Oort cloud. Here are a couple of excerpts from the book. Sisko grunted, gazing out at the expanse of dark-crusted cometary ice that formed the natural hull of Starbase One. Above the curving ice horizon, the blackness of Earth's Oort cloud should have glittered with bright stars and the barely brighter glow of the distant sun. Instead, what it glittered with were the docking lights of a dozen short-range attack ships, older and more angular versions of the Defiant, as well as the looming bulk of two Galaxy-class starships, the Mukai-Kubo and the Breedlove. And then, elsewhere in the book, Sisko scowled. "Forgive my bluntness, Admiral, but I've been dragged from my command station without explanation, ordered not to use my own ship under any circumstances, brought to the oldest and least useful starbase in the Federation." He made a gesture of reined-in impatience at the bleak cometary landscape outside the windows. "And you're telling me you're not sure how urgent this problem is?" In the 1983 TOS novel Mutiny on the Enterprise by Robert E. Vardaman, the Enterprise puts back to Starbase One after completing a diplomatic mission. In this story, Starbase One is not a facility orbiting a planet, but rather one on the surface of an unnamed planet. It's also possible that the starbase designated Starbase One in Discovery was rebuilt later at a location closer to Earth. They do show it in the episode Orbiting a Planet. Now, I don't know what planet that might be that far out. There is a planetoid, a dwarf planet in our solar system called Eris that is that far out. It's actually right around the point that Stamets specifies, but it wouldn't have an atmosphere and look blue like that planet. So I think we've got a little bit of an art department mix-up at play here, perhaps. But again, we don't know. Going back to the novels, there's another novel from 1983, A.C. Crispin's Yesterday's Sun, in which Starbase One monitored a Romulan transgression across the neutral zone. And in Tales of the Dominion War, an anthology of short stories published in 2004, Starbase One is mentioned in conjunction with the Breen attack on Earth in the short story 11 Hours Out by Dave Gallanter. And in his 2005 novel Articles of the Federation, which I already mentioned earlier, Keith DeCandido has the Triniac delegation being beamed to Starbase One for medical treatment. In this case, they are sent there because there are no hospitals in Paris that can treat them. So given this, it would seem that Starbase One is the facility orbiting Earth, the one that we normally just call space dock. Bottom line on Starbase One is that it isn't clear what it is. It could be space dock orbiting Earth. It could be a base in the Oort cloud. It could be a base on the surface of an unnamed planet in the outer reaches of the Sol system. Or it could be a collective name for all of these. But in Discovery, it isn't space dock. Stamets states that it is 100 astronomical units, or AUs, from Earth. So it isn't orbiting our planet. 100 AUs is right around the outer edge of the Kuiper Belt and the dwarf planet Eris, which I mentioned a moment ago. Eris is actually 27% larger than Pluto, and it sits at around 97 AUs from the Sun. So it's right there in the right spot for what Stamets is talking about. And if you're wondering how far away that is, Eris is about 3 times farther from the Sun than Pluto. The Oort cloud, on the other hand, starts at about 5,000 AUs and stretches to 50,000 AUs from the Sun. So it's unlikely, even though some of these stories have talked about Starbase One being in the Oort cloud, it's unlikely that that's what they're talking about on Discovery. How far away is the nearest star in reality? Well, Proxima Centauri is more than 271,000 AUs from Earth, or about 4.22 light years. So even though these numbers sound big, 100 AUs, 5,000 AUs, 50,000 AUs, the nearest star is still way, way, way further away. Does any of this really matter? Probably not that much. The point that the writers were trying to make in The War Without, The War Within is that the Klingons are getting really close to Earth. They probably shouldn't have used the name Starbase One, given the common connection fans make between space dock and a starbase. And the designation One implies the first, the most important, and probably that thing we always see orbiting Earth. Naturally, we kind of jump to that when we hear Starbase One. They also probably shouldn't have put some specific distances into play, since they use a unit of measurement that has a very specific meaning within the solar system, and immediately viewers start calculating. Okay, 100 AUs from Earth, that's going to put the base here. That doesn't make sense. That's what a lot of people felt. At the end of the day, for me, it's not a big deal. But if you were wondering about Starbase One's role in other Star Trek, there it is. And that role is not much. I think it just sounded good for this story, and so they decided to go with it. Created a little bit of confusion in the process, but hey, not a big deal. All right, so those are the notes from The Edge for week 14 of Star Trek Discovery. Notes is just part of our coverage of Discovery. We have new coverage 5 days a week. Be sure to check out Live from The Edge on Monday nights at 9 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern when Brandy and Bruce go live on YouTube. You can take part in the show by interacting with them on Twitter or through chat. And if you can't join live, you can still listen to the show on Tuesday morning when it is released as a podcast. Commentary tracks will be available each Wednesday as tracks from the Edge, and we'll discuss your feedback on postcards from the Edge on Thursdays. And of course, you can catch full analysis on the Edge main show on Fridays. I wrap up everything over the weekend with notes from the Edge, with this kind of deep dive into the links between Discovery and the broader franchise, and you'll find all of these in the main feed for the Edge and in the Trek FM master feed. And all along the way, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Discovery. The best place to do that is in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, where Amy Nelson will collect your feedback for postcards from the Edge. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right on up. If you're not yet a member, it is a closed group, so you'll need to click Join and then answer 2 questions, 2 simple questions, and then a moderator can let you in. You can also find us on Twitter at TrekFM, or send us email by using the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Just choose to send to a show and choose the Edge, and that will come to me and to all the hosts on all the different sub-shows of the Edge. If you'd like to find me personally, you can find me there in the Babel Conference, of course, but perhaps the best place to converse with me is on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. My username is C Bryan Jones, the letter C, and Bryan with a Y, and that's my name pretty much everywhere in social media, so you can find me pretty easily. If you'd like to hear me discuss Star Trek Beyond Discovery, you can catch my main show, The Ready Room, and I also co-host The Orb, our Deep Space Nine podcast with Matthew Rushing. The Ready Room will have a new episode this week. I'm hoping to get it out by the middle of the week. And of course, as usual, I'm joined by Larry Nemechek. And Larry and I are talking about the next generation this time. That's all I can say at the moment. But I think you'll find it very interesting. So tune into the Ready Room later this week. You'll also hear me on lots of older episodes from various shows. As I used to host 7 shows every week, I actually started a lot of the shows that are now hosted by other people. And you can find my writing about Star Trek on the official website at startrek.com. I'd like to take a moment and thank our associate producers here on The Edge, Norman C. Lau, Tony Robinson, Tom Paleo, Lisa Slack, Shoaib Mirza, Richard Rutledge, James Muldrow, and Cornelia Rutner. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. It really makes a huge difference. In fact, it's essential for us keeping the network going. So I really appreciate all your support. And for those of you who are not yet a supporter of the network on Patreon, I hope you'll check it out. Just go to patreon.com/TrekFM for all the details. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. You can find out everything you need to know there about how to support the show and the network. You can become an associate producer. You can take part in the Patrons Roundtable, which is a podcast with hosts and other listeners. You can get access to our special website, Patron Zone, and more. So please check it out, patreon.com/TrekFM. And thank you once again so much to everyone who is supporting us right now. Well, that's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for listening. Join me again next time as we jot down more notes right on the paper's edge.